Hello, I'm Anthony Rowland. I'm one of the main organisers of English Shared Futures this year, along with Robert Eagleston and Gail Marshall, which, as you know, has been sadly postponed until next year. But we have a series of events this weekend, including this, which is one of the Literature We Love series, which, because of the timing, is also literature we love during lockdown. So we're all meant to choose one book to talk about. I'm cheating because I'm actually using two. I'll explain why in a second. Firstly, my novel choice is this one, Louis-Ferdinand Céline, A Journey to the End of the Night. So if you'll excuse my French, Voyage au bord de la nuit. And it sounds like this is going to be a kind of a crass response to lockdown, the title Journey to the End of the Night, but it isn't. I hope to explain why in a few minutes. Now, because we live in a fictionist world, and because my expertise is mainly poetry, I also wanted to include a poetry choice. So I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about a book which I'm reading at the moment, poetry collection by James Byrne, which is called Places You Leave. Why then did I choose these two books? Well, firstly, Journey to the End of the Night. I was in a Q&A session last summer with a well-known contemporary author, and I mentioned this book in the Q&A and said it was one of the most terrifying books I'd ever read. And then I kind of afterwards I thought, well, I want to go away and think about actually why that is. And when it came to lockdown, in a sense, I wanted to test the lockdown against the most kind of miserable, misanthropic book I had ever read. And this is it. I'll explain why in a minute. The James Byrne book, Places You Leave, well, the title also suggests kind of places that the poet brings you to as well. And the book opens with a poem I'll talk about in a bit called Cox's Bazar, which not many people have heard about in the UK, but is the biggest refugee camp in the world. It has about 800,000 people in it at the moment. And about 2 weeks ago, there was the first recorded instance of COVID-19 in the camp. And ever since then, I've been kind of worrying that we're going to hear about Cox's Bazar a lot in the news. We haven't, luckily, so far, but that might be the way that obviously the UK media reports or doesn't report things that are happening elsewhere in the world. Okay, so to go back to Journey to the End of the Night, firstly, the author, Louis-Ferdinand Céline, was born in 1894, did various jobs, worked in jewellers, he was a doctor and so on, and all these different things happening to work their way into this semi-autobiographical, picaresque novel, which goes all over the world. We start off with a jingoistic incident in a Paris cafe, where the author suddenly sees this group of soldiers. This is at the beginning of World War I passing. He jumps up, says to a friend, right, I'm going to go, I'm going to be recruited. We end up through a series of adventures in World War I at the beginning of the novel. He then is wounded, he leaves the army, he ends up in Africa. Céline had some experience of working in French Cameroon. We then end up in America. He starts working for a factory which is meant to be a representation of one of the Ford factories. He then goes back to France and works as a doctor in a suburb of Paris, where the novel ends, which is a very brief kind of summary of about 390 pages. Now, one of the things that was drawn to immediately in this book is that, speaking of the author, Céline later on, after this book was published in 1932, went on to pen a number of egregiously anti-Semitic pamphlets. And again, one of my kind of responses to this book is not only kind of literature you love, but literature that you've enjoyed reading, that you deeply engrossed in, but also that you find extremely troubling in terms of what the author did and the author's life and how to kind of work with those two things. So maybe just mention three things then about the Celine book before I move on to the Poetry Places You Leave. Firstly, why is this kind of a lockdown book? Well, as I mentioned already, it's a book which it's constantly kind of pushing against the reader. And one of the things it does is talk about how we're all really individuals in the world. Nobody is around to help us. We're all basically rotting carcasses waiting to die, and kind of testing that against what's been happening over the last few weeks. Altruistic moments, not everywhere, but altruistic moments, for example, on our streets, in which the newsagent, unprompted, started delivering groceries to a woman in the 70s next door. Things like that mean that at the moment, what we're all experiencing grates against this sense of individualism. Also, it's a book in which, despite all this, despite its misanthropy, it is a beautifully written book. There are moments of glorious, euphonious prose which keep kind of bringing the reader back in as it pushes you away in terms of what it's describing. It's also, I think, one of the reasons I'm drawn to it is it feels like a very contemporary novel, and the reason for this is definitely partly to do with its kind of popular French. This is 1932, but it reads like a novel, certainly in the English word, that was written in about 1964. We're all kind of used to this kind of colloquial prose in novels now, Capturing the Rye and so on onwards. But this is 30, 40 years earlier in 1932. And I can feel when I'm reading the book that, because obviously this is written in French, that the popular French, the colloquial words are kind of straining against the translation. But I do get a sense of why this is so important as one of the first books written in this colloquial style in France. Just to give you a brief example, I shall read the first line of the novel, which goes, "Here's how it started. I never said a word, not one word." And just in those brief sentences, you get a sense of, from the original French, a kind of brisk ça, which is repeated in that first line, a real kind of affront, as it would have been at the time, to the literary reader. It's not using, for example, the more literary cela, as it would be in French. So because this is a translation, all this doesn't come through, but it really does kind of directly through its colloquialism to begin to speak to the contemporary reader. Now, one of the other reasons I'm drawn to this book is, as somebody who's worked on a lot of testimonial literature, my last book was called Poetry as Testimony. I actually came across Celine first via a Polish author, Tadeusz Borowski, who in his prose writings after the war, Borowski was a political prisoner in Auschwitz, he wrote these short stories which were based on Celine's work. So Borowski took me to Celine, and Celine's writing about World War One. And again, it strikes me that it sounds very kind of contemporary. This is very, very early, written in the 1920s, absurdist version of World War One, and a satirical version of, for example, the generals. In the 1920s, a lot of the generals in World War One were still held up, like Haig and so on, as war heroes. But this is diatribe against these kind of people. This is, if you like, the kind of Blackadder version of World War One, but without Blackadder's sentimentality. Again, I'll just read you a brief passage to try and get across what I mean by this. This is right at the beginning of the novel, and the main character, Bardamou, says, "Nobody could dispute the Colonel's bravery." I have to hand it to the Colonel. His bravery was remarkable. He roamed around in the middle of the road, up and down and back and forth in the midst of the bullets, as calmly as if he'd been waiting for a friend on a station platform, except just a tiny bit impatient. Okay, I'll move on to the poetry now. My poetry choice, Places You Leave. I believe there's some collages on the website by James Byrne that link to this collection. Hopefully there will be an event at the Poetry Cafe in London in the autumn if COVID doesn't do away with that. So as I said, Places You Leave is also places that we don't know about, that it brings the reader to, such as Cox's Bazaar. James actually went to the camp in January 19, and of all things did some poetry workshops in the middle of the camp, sometimes for people who couldn't speak English, in order to learn English, using writers like T.S. Eliot to teach the children and the adults. And some of these kind of wonderful anecdotes about him being in the camp come through into the poetry, such as a moment where a child has been learning poetry during the day, then can't sleep at night in the tent, and the mother comes in and says, why can't you sleep? What's going on? And the child replies, Emily Dickinson, Emily Dickinson. So as well as those kind of wonderful moments that come into the poetry, you get a sense that James, a poet narrator, is kind of almost despairing at times. The kind of testimony from what's happened to the refugees in Myanmar is terrible. And yet, a bit similar to the Celine, there are these moments of euphonious, rhythmical prose poetry that draw you back in, that make you think that actually things are not completely lost. It's not redemptive poetry, but there's a sense of possible redemption. I'll maybe just read a section of the poetry to end and let it speak for itself. So this is about halfway through the opening poem, Cox's Bazaar. Looking at you, between palm branches brittled by soil erosion. Why is it you live in the middle of the largest refugee camp in the world, and they're calling it a lost treasure, a forgotten national park? They ask you to plant trees to save the environment. Yes, you think, a few more trees to hide the smell of the latrine. How do you write about environment? You try for the present, the sensory, but your eyes sting, your ears hum, and the smell is flesh and smoke. I want to write about family, but I have no family. The idea of the eternal traveller does not hold. To think of poetry as Orphic, to unthink memory, to unriver the severed head, as if the world were a wound flapping its bandages, as if the world were a wound, as if. Okay, thank you for listening to my literature we love under lockdown, and I've had two choices: Celine, Journey to the End of the Night, and James Byrne's Places You Leave. I'm Anthony Rowland. I'm a professor of poetry at Manchester Metropolitan University and one of the main organisers for Shared Futures. Thank you.